How to win friends and influence people. Chapter 1. Avoid criticizing. Beginning in 1912, Dale Carnegie conducted public speaking classes catering to business people across the world. Over the years, it became clear this education wasn't enough, and that people needed more than just public speaking lessons. They also needed training in the fine art of getting along with people in everyday business and social contacts, Carnegie explains. In the following chapters, you'll discover how to build and maintain relationships while advancing your goals, with insights from this all-time best-selling book. Criticizing others isn't likely to get you what you want, so avoid altogether. The first principle Carnegie outlines is, if you want to gather honey, don't kick over the beehive. If you want to get something from someone, don't criticize them. For example, psychologist B.F. Skinner found that animals rewarded for good behavior learned more quickly than those punished for bad. The same can be applied to human behavior. When humans are criticized, it's unlikely they'll change, and instead will carry a grudge against their criticizer. This is because criticism can hurt someone's self-esteem and can make them resentful towards the person who gave the criticism. So the next time you feel like criticizing someone, remember that criticisms are likely to fall on deaf ears and may result in you being disliked. Chapter 2. Show appreciation. Carnegie explains that all people have a gnawing and unfaltering human hunger to feel important. You can satisfy this hunger by showing them honest and sincere appreciation. Once you do, they'll be more likely to help you. Key idea: showing sincere appreciation for others will encourage them to help you. In 1921, Charles Schwab became the first president of Andrew Carnegie's company, the United States Steel Company. Schwab's yearly salary was $1 million. This was during a time when income tax didn't exist, and someone making $50 a week was seen as well off. Schwab explained how he advanced to such a high position. It was not because of his knowledge of steel or his intelligence. He was chosen for this position because of his ability to inspire his employees to work harder. In particular, Schwab found that criticism was guaranteed to hinder people's willingness to work hard. So instead, Schwab aimed to arouse enthusiasm by constantly showing appreciation and encouragement. This is contrary to many management styles. If an employee makes a mistake, most supervisors will immediately criticize them. But by constantly encouraging his subordinates, Schwab helped them feel important and thus more willing to work hard on his behalf. Chapter 3. Inspire a desire. Carnegie says that the only way on earth to influence other people is to talk about what they want and show them how to get it. So, if you hope to get someone to do what you want, you have to ask yourself, how can I make this person want to do this? Key idea: get someone to do what you want by appealing to the other person's desires. Carnegie tells the story of his student, Barbara Anderson, who needed to move from New York City to Phoenix due to her son's health. Anderson needed a new banking job, so she wrote to 12 banks inquiring about openings. In these letters, she could have detailed what she hoped to get from a new job, or explained why she needed to move. But instead, she framed her letters with specific focus on what the banks desired. Anderson received a response from 11 of the 12 banks she wrote to. This was because she spoke of their desires, rather than her own. Thus, if you want to increase your chance of getting something you want, you need to appeal to what the other side wants. Chapter 4. Show interest in others. Key idea: show genuine interest in others, and they are more likely to do what you want. Carnegie says, all of us, be we workers in a factory, clerks in an office, or even a king upon his throne, all of us like people who admire us. By demonstrating your admiration, you're likely to get on someone's good side. You can accomplish this by expressing interest in the other person. For example, Carnegie once conducted a course in fiction writing at the Brooklyn Institute of the Arts. Carnegie wanted to invite a series of prolific writers to speak and needed to find a way to convince them to attend. He and his students wrote letters to the authors, saying they deeply admired their work and knew they were probably too busy to prepare a lecture. Rather than just ask them to attend, the students sent a series of questions they hoped the authors would answer about themselves. These personal questions helped the authors feel admired and important, so they decided to come speak to the class. Carnegie went on to use the same method to compel Franklin D. Roosevelt and other prominent figures to come speak at his conferences. So if you show genuine interest in another person, they're more likely to want to help you. Chapter 5. Smile and use people's names. There are 2 simple techniques you can use to get on anyone's good side. The first is to smile. For example, Carnegie shares the story of Maria Gonzalez, a new employee of a company whose secluded office left her feeling isolated. She was unsure of how to make friends and participate in the larger office camaraderie, and so she decided to simply smile more. The results were immediate. Co-workers would return her smile, inquire how she was, and eventually these acquaintances turned into friends. The second technique is to use people's names. Carnegie says that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. For example, industrialist Andrew Carnegie once wanted to sell steel rails to Pennsylvania Railroad owner J. Edgar Thompson. To win him over, Carnegie built a steel mill in Pittsburgh and called it Edgar Thomson Steel Works. Thomson would go on to buy his steel exclusively from Carnegie, rather than any competitors. So if you want to make a good impression and create friendships, try smiling and referring to people by name. Chapter 6. Ask people about themselves. Key idea: advance your position by asking people about themselves. As we've learned, everyone wants to feel valued and admired. You can make them feel so by asking them specific questions. Carnegie tells the story of a poor Dutch immigrant named Edward Bok who became one of the most successful American magazine editors. At 13 years old, Bok started working for Western Union, with only 6 years of schooling and no connections. Using his salary, he bought encyclopedias, looked up famous people, and learned about them. He began writing to these famous people and inquiring about specific events in their lives. These famous people responded enthusiastically. For example, he asked General Grant about a specific battle he had been in, and Grant invited the 14-year-old boy to dinner. Soon, Bok was corresponding with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Louisa May Alcott, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Mary Todd Lincoln. His discussions with these men and women inspired his ambition and eventually shaped his illustrious career. Thus, asking people to talk about themselves can help you make connections and eventually advance your aspirations. Chapter 7. Talk about the other's interest. Theodore Roosevelt famously astonished his guests with his ability to talk about things that interested them. Carnegie explains that, the night before social occasions, Roosevelt would stay up late and read up on subjects he knew mattered to his guests. Roosevelt went through the trouble because, like all good leaders, he knew the royal road to a person's heart is to talk about the things they treasure most. Key idea: speaking about the other person's interests can help you win them over. Speaking about someone else's interests is how Edward L. Chalif successfully fundraised money on behalf of the Boy Scouts. Chalif wanted the president of one of the biggest corporations in the US to pay for one Boy Scouts trip to Europe. Luckily, Chalif had just heard through the grapevine that this president had recently written $1 million check, and instead of cashing it, framed it. Chalif used Carnegie's recommended technique. "I admired it and asked him to tell me all about how it happened to be drawn," he shared. The president contentedly shared the story of his check, only later asking Chalif why he had come to see him. After Chalif explained the situation, he paid for 5 boys' trips, gave him a line of credit for $1,000, and told him to stay in Europe for 7 weeks. This success lies in the fact Chalif began the conversation focusing on what mattered to the president, and thus made himself more likable. Chapter 8. Avoid arguments. Key idea: there is no real way to win an argument, so you should avoid them altogether. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, Carnegie says. In other words, you can't win arguments. If you lose, you lose. And if you win, you've made a person feel inferior and shot their pride. So how can you convince someone to agree with you without making them resentful? Carnegie shares the story of his student, car salesman Patrick O'Hare. O'Hare was incredibly argumentative. If a potential buyer spoke badly of any of his cars, he would immediately get into a fight with them. Although he often won these fights, he realized it didn't matter. His winning was not helping him sell cars. With Carnegie's help, the next time a potential buyer said something like, "I'm going to go buy a truck from a competitor," O'Hare didn't argue. Instead he agreed, insisting that the competitor's truck was a great option, and that if the buyer chose it, it wouldn't be a mistake. The buyer was taken aback, and was more open to hearing O'Hare explain why his truck was a good choice. By avoiding arguments, O'Hare was able to get his point across while also making the sale. Chapter 9. Never say you're wrong. Key idea: if you tell someone they are wrong, they are unlikely to admit it. Carnegie once hired an interior decorator to make curtains for his home. When the bill arrived, Carnegie was upset to see how high the price was. When a friend came to visit him the next day, he mentioned the high price. She was shocked and told Carnegie she thought he had been taken advantage of. Even though what she was saying was the truth, few people want to be told they've made a mistake. So Carnegie insisted he had paid a fair price and that the quality of the draperies was worth it. The next day another friend came, but this one admired the curtains and said she wished she could afford something similar. Because she didn't hurt his ego, Carnegie admitted to her he was overcharged and that he couldn't afford them himself. This shows that even if we know we're wrong, we often won't admit it to others if they point it out to us. So if we want to point out a mistake someone made, speaking diplomatically and not outwardly saying you're wrong may help. Chapter 10. Admit that you might be wrong. Key idea: quickly admitting to your mistakes will make you more likable. An effective way to get what you want while being perceived positively is to openly admit that you might be wrong. This was the technique used by commercial artist Ferdinand E. Warren with a particularly tricky boss. Warren explained to Carnegie that sometimes art editors ask for a quick turnaround for commissions, which might lead to hasty errors. One editor in particular was aggressive about these mistakes and always delighted to find fault with some little thing. And so the next time this occurred, Warren didn't push back. Instead, he openly self-criticized. The editor quickly started to defend Warren, arguing that the mistake wasn't that serious after. Eventually, the editor was solely defending Warren. By the end of their meeting, the editor took Warren to lunch, gave him a check, and another commission. By admitting to his mistake so openly, and by speaking ill of himself before the editor got the chance, Warren was able to win him over. Chapter 11. Get them to say yes. Key idea: push your counterpart to agree by getting them to say yes at the beginning. When someone says no, Carnegie argues that the whole neurological system sets itself on guard against acceptance. Furthermore, once someone says no, their ego is involved, so they feel they have to stick to what they said. If instead you give them the opportunity to say yes, they are able to let their guard down and listen to you. Bank teller James Eberson experienced the benefits of this strategy firsthand. One day a customer came in to open an account. Eberson handed him the necessary forms, but the customer refused to fill out crucial parts, like the field designating next of kin. Previously, Eberson would have given him an ultimatum: either you fill this out or you can't open an account. But this time, he tried to get the customer to just say yes. I told him the information he refused to give was not absolutely necessary. But then, he continued, suppose you have money in this bank at your death. Wouldn't you like to have the bank transfer it to your next of kin? The customer said yes. He soon realized the teller was asking for this information not for the bank's sarcasm, but for the customer's. I found that by getting him to say yes from the outset, he forgot the issue at stake and was happy to do all the things I suggested, Eberson concluded. Chapter 12. Make it a competition. How can you convince someone to work harder? Charles Schwab offers an innovative technique: turn it into a competition. One of his factories was experiencing decreased productivity. Its supervisors had tried reprimands and disciplinary action, but nothing worked. So Schwab decided to turn the work into a competition. He took a piece of chalk and recorded on the floor how many products were made during each shift. The first day he listed 6. When the night crew came in, they saw this number and felt compelled to do better. When Schwab returned the next day, the night shift had rubbed out the 6 and replaced it with a 7. The next crew, in turn, saw the 7 and pushed it to 10. Schwab said, the way to get things done is to stimulate competition. I do not mean in a sordid, money-getting way, but in the desire to excel. Thus, if you want to compel someone to work harder, you can try instead to turn it into a competition. The main ideas, Chapter 12. Inspiring a sense of competition can encourage people to work harder. Since criticism is hardly ever effective, encouraging healthy competition can push people to excel.